Today we're going to talk about proportion word problems. So first let's go over the steps to solving a proportion word problem. So step one is we're setting up a blank proportion. And then we're going to identify the two units that are being discussed or compared in the problem. Going to label the top row of the proportion with one of those units and the bottom row with the other unit. Then we fill the left column with our initial ratio and the right column with our end result. So one of the two spots should contain an unknown variable. That is what we are actually solving for. And then we learned how to solve a proportion, so once you've got it set up, you should be able to solve. So let's look at problem 1. A zoo requires that one adult accompany every 7 students that visit the zoo. How many adults must accompany 28 students? So this is an easier problem. Maybe you're able to look at this and solve it without a proportion, but we're going to practice using a proportion to solve so we can apply it to ones that maybe aren't as obvious. So first off, I'm looking at what two units I'm comparing. We are talking about adults and we are talking about students. So I'm going to label the top adults and the bottom students. Technically, it does not matter if you have students on top and adults on the bottom, as long as when we're plugging in numbers, anything that applies to adults is on the top, anything that applies to students is on the bottom. So let's first look for that initial ratio. So initially, if I look at this, it says that we have one adult for every 7 students. So that's the first time that it's comparing adults to students. So that's my initial ratio, one adult to 7 students. Then I have to think of what the other number that's given is talking about. So if I look, I see 28, so that's my third number in there, and it's talking about students. So we put students on the bottom, so the 28 needs to stay on the bottom with students, which means we are solving for the adults. And if you look at the question, it says how many adults, so that's our unknown. Now we've got a proportion that we can solve. So I'm looking for the diagonal that has two numbers that are diagonal from each other. So 1 times 28, which gives me 28. And then I'm dividing by the number that is in the same diagonal as the variable. So dividing by 7 gives me 4. And what are we talking about? Well, the x is with adults, so we're talking about 4 adults. All right, let's look at example 2. To make yellow icing, you mix 2 cups of white icing with 9 drops of yellow food coloring. How much yellow food coloring should you mix with 5 cups of white icing to get the same shade? So again, I'm looking for my initial ratio first. If I look at the two numbers that are given to me first, we've got 2 cups of white icing with 9 drops of yellow food coloring. So we are talking about cups of icing. I'm going to put that on top. And then the other unit that we're talking about is food coloring. Drops of food coloring. Now again, anything related to icing now needs to go on top. Anything related to food color needs to go on the bottom. So the first two numbers that are given are 2 cups of white icing, 9 drops of food coloring. So the 2 cups of icing goes on top. The 9 drops of food coloring goes on the bottom. Then I'm looking for the other number that is given to me. I see 5 down here. And what is that 5 talking about? It's talking about cups of white icing. Well, we put icing on top. So the 9, sorry, not the 9. The 5 is going to go on top, which means we are solving for drops of food coloring. And if you look, it says how much food coloring. Now we've got a proportion that we can solve. I'm looking at which diagonal has 2 numbers. This one right here does, so we are going to multiply 9 times 5, which gives us 45, and then we are dividing by the number that's in the same diagonal as the variable. So that is 2. We are going to divide by 2, and we get 22 and a half, 22 and 5/10. And what were we solving for? It's on the bottom, which was food coloring, so drops of food coloring. All right, let's flip it over to the back here. Example 3, the Millers drove 105 miles on 4 gallons of gas. At this rate, how many miles can they drive on 6 gallons of gas? So again, first thing I'm looking for is what are the 2 units that we are talking about. If I look here, I see that we are talking about miles and gallons of gas. So miles and gallons of gas. What are the 2 numbers in that initial ratio? We've got 105 and 4. The 105 is talking about miles, and the 4 is talking about gallons. So now I'm looking for what the other number is that's given to us in the problem. I see 6. Well, what is that 6 referring to? It's talking about gallons of gas, which we have on the bottom here, so we're going to put 6 on the bottom, which means we are solving for the miles, and if you look at the question, it says how many miles. Now we've got our proportion, let's solve. Which diagonal has 2 numbers? This diagonal right here has 2 numbers, so we're going to multiply 105 times 6, which gives us 630. And then we're going to divide by the variable that's on the same side, same diagonal as divide by the number that's in the same diagonal as the variable, which is 4. So divide that by 4, and we get 157.5 miles. One thing that you should always be checking to see is if your answer makes sense. So for 4 gallons, we got 105 miles. If we have more gallons, the number of miles that we can get there should be greater than the 105, right? So always checking to see if your answer makes sense. All right, number 4. If it takes Mike 18 minutes to read 4 pages in a book, how long would it take him to read 10 pages? So what 2 units am I talking about? Well, let's look at this initial ratio here. It says 18 minutes to read 4 pages. So we are talking about minutes and pages. So what are the numbers? We've got 18 minutes, so minutes is on top. The 18 goes on top. We've got 4 pages. Pages on the bottom, so 4 goes on the bottom. Then the other number that's given to us is 10. And what is that 10 talking about? Pages. Pages was on the bottom, so we're going to put 10 on the bottom, which means we are solving for the number of minutes, which makes sense. When it says how long would it take, that's talking about the time. So let's go ahead and solve the proportion. Which diagonal has 2 numbers in it? This one right here. So we're going to multiply 18 times 10, which is 180. And we are dividing by the number that's in the same diagonal as the variable, which is the number 4 right there. 180 divided by 4 gives you 45. Well, what was the 45 talking about? It was talking about minutes. All right, one more, and then I'm going to give you the you try to try on your own. So example 5, at Vernon Hills High School, 3 students are in a club for every 5 total students. If there are 1,900 total students at VHHS, how many students are in a club? So at Vernon Hills High School, 3 students are in a club for every 5 total students. So that's our initial ratio here. Well, we have students and students, so we're not going to put just students as our unit. What specifically are we talking about? Well, it's talking about students that are in a club, so I'm going to put the number in a club compared to the total students. So 3 are in a club for every 5 total. Then the other number that's given to us is 1,900. Well, what is 1,900? It's 1,900 total students. So our total is on the bottom. We're solving for how many are in a club. And again, if you look at the question, it's asking how many are in a club. So what 2 numbers are diagonal from each other? We've got these 2 right here, so we're going to do 3 times 1,900, which gives us 5,700. And we're going to divide by the number that's in the same diagonal as the variable, which is 5. So we divide by 5. We get 1,140 students are in a club. All right, here you try. We'll fill in. In 3 scoops of ice cream, there are 810 calories. How many calories are there in 7 scoops of ice cream? Go ahead and try that one on your own.